Oups, ah, j'étais un petit peu dans l'œuf. Finalement, aujourd'hui, Fortnite ne marchait pas pendant un laps de temps. Je viens de l'ouvrir pour voir. Seems to be working fine. Fait qu'on va pouvoir jouer. On va voir qu'est-ce que le serveur a l'air. En espérant qu'il y ait quand même d'autres joueurs. Fait que voici. Oh, on va aller à l'autre page. Pas que j'oublie comme hier. On va s'assurer que le volume fonctionne. Moi, il me faut mes écouteurs, bien sûr. Sinon, je n'entends rien du... Oh, c'était fort. Ok, allons voir le boutique. Je suis pas la joueur de tennis. Thor, I'm disappointed. J'aurais voulu qu'il fasse comme l'original, les films d'avant. On va voir si les missions sont plus faciles ce soir en solo. Ça, je peux le faire. On va aller là. En souhaitant que ce soir, je suis meilleur. Think positive. Les simulations. Gonna stop crying.
Vader could do nothing to influence them. Even when they were there to protect him, they would not listen to him and would put terror towards Darth. Not to mention that Darth Vader knew his true intent and true purpose while these Red Royal Guards were always present. And as stated earlier, this was a threat to Vader knew it, even though he didn't say it. But anyway, friends and students of the Force, this is the real reason why Darth Vader and the Red Royal Guards so exist, and why anytime that we're around, it simply infuriates me. But anyway, leave your thoughts on this down below. What are your thoughts on Darth Vader's hatred for the Red Royal Guards? And do you think his hatred was justified? As always, my friends, thank you guys so much for watching the video. May the Force be with you, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.
C'est quoi que je fasse? Des coffres, je pense.
Is all about the Sith species, the race that would inspire and become eponymous with the dark side followers of the Force. This will cover over 100,000 years of history, looking into the biology, society, and culture, as well as the most influential members of the species. The first segment is sponsored, Audible. And I've been saying this on live streams forever. You need to experience
Lucky number 79.
The quality of the narration, the subtle sound effects and music in the background, all helps to really bring you in. Just take a listen for yourself.
The last few rays of livestock hung in the air when he finally reached his destination. The Valley of the Dark Lords lay sprawled out before him, hidden beneath the cover of Twilight's moon. He briefly considered stopping for the night and making camp until dawn, then rejected the idea. Day or night would make no difference once he was inside the tombs.
And that quality is true for countless Star Wars titles here, but also tons of other fandoms like Mass Effect and Halo. You can access Audible through your computer or through the app on your phone. I use the app as
Ok, tu vas dire mon stage.
house, driving with its streamlined
Je l'ai terminé, ça fait 2
and I actually
semaines.
often go to sleep listening to stories of the old Sith Wars. With the sleep
Ça a
timer
super bien
feature, making
été.
sure you don't get too far
Ils m'ont mis
in.
des A partout.
Oh, the bookmark button allows you to keep place and even add notes. For example, here are
Je
some
suis
of the
autonome,
notes from Thrawn.
que le patron a même écrit sur le formulaire d'évaluation à l'école, que c'est genre faites vite, j'ai peur de la perdre puis je la veux, là, tu sais, là. Je me souviens plus les mots exacts, là. Mais il y a hâte de m'avoir, de peur de me faire voler avec les notes que j'ai eues. Je crois que j'ai été la meilleure de la classe, je suis pas sûre, là.
You can always purchase more at a discounted price, or check out tons of the free titles that are included with your membership or
Go back.
podcast. Any title that you pick up with your credits are yours to keep forever, even if you cancel your membership. Credits do roll over, and you can keep them if you don't use them. And you can also download titles so that you can use them when you go offline. It's a no-brainer if you're watching a video like this and you're this big a fan of the world. Again, that's audible.com/metaverse or text metaverse to 500-500.
Si elle
Let's head
regarde le
back to the
bug,
Sith species. We'll start by heading to their home world of Corvus,
si le
located
download est
at grid
fini,
coordinates R5 within the Stygian caldera on the outer rim territory.
je
The
vais
species
regarder
would
dans
evolve on one of the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy, one that had a natural affinity for the dark side. planet covered in mostly deserts, canyons, and
La
mountains,
cloche
but
est
with a
encore
few
pas.
swampy regions. This terrain was covered in horrifying beasts like the Shirax, the lower slugs, and Torrentatats. One of the many mysterious ways in which the force functions is that certain species and locations have stronger connections to the light or dark side of the force. The said species had an unparalleled natural connection to the dark side. Think about how few beings from any given species had a notable force connection.
Ouais, j'ai pas connecté Twitch aujourd'hui parce que j'ai remarqué qu'il veut pas, ça fait 2 jours. Fait que c'est juste Facebook et YouTube. Mais c'est mes deux plus importants. Malgré que j'ai 280 clics, je pense membre dans Twitch. Mais je veux bâtir plus Facebook et YouTube.
Although they would get their nourishment from both plants and animals, they could literally feed off of the dark side as well. Its energy is providing them with sustenance to survive long periods without physical nourishment, drawing some Sith to strive to live purely off of this dark side energy, in which they could truly say they were the physical embodiment of darkness. As for their physical characteristics, their skin color is almost always red, though some could range from the slightest pink to dark black. The general rule being that their skin color is lighter at birth and grew darker over time, while their eye color could range from orange, red, yellow, white, or black. At multiple spots in their body, they would have these bone spurs that stick out to the skin, while their faces have these tendrils hanging from their cheeks. There are also the stalks over the eyebrows and the sides of the face, while each of these tendrils had a role in nonverbal communication. Twitches or quivering conveying anger, lifting them could be doubt or questioning, and curling showed no one was relaxed. Most all had 3-digit hands, and one acted like a thumb, though some individuals had 5 of them.
Oui, ok,
Nearly all of them were left-hand dominant. Even before the year 100,000
j'ai oublié de remercier le boss.
they had already developed a complex culture of
On est
alchemy,
97. Bon, mais je passe
though the
centième à
concept of
partir.
war was probably a strange one to the Sith. They might have considered it a separate thing. They believed
Donc,
that
j'ouvre
existence
un
meant
coffre
to be
là-dedans.
engaged with violent conflict as one's living.
On est 4
Tribes
qui
would slay each
parachute.
other endlessly and make sacrifices of living beings to their gods, the supernatural beings that they could identify in the dark side. Each of these tribes were referred to as circles, and each was led by at least one Sith sorcerer, who used the energies riled up by the combat and sacrifices to perfect alchemy and their magics. The sort of which that would be lost in the Sith of the late Republic era, only being glimpsed in the odd rituals done by Sidious, or something more similar to that of the Night Sisters. This allowed them to create talismans imbued with dark powers, which could do anything to increase one's connection to the Force, turn a light sider to the dark side, provide biological repairs, or shield one from Force attack. These are most often used during rituals. There are everything from tomes to manuscripts to pass on the rituals, which were themselves imbued with this magic, as well as the weapons and armor that they used. The actual armor itself was channeling the dark side, while things like powerful Sith swords, or Tosis weed vibroblades called Sith tremor swords, and the Sith war swords, which combine the physical damage with various magical effects, like inducing anger or madness, and most often nightmarish hallucinations. There are also a myriad of poisons that these alchemists would produce, and range weapons like the Lambor combined a lot of these technologies in one, making a full-on disc armor, with discs that were covered in these dark sides of poisons. The most disturbing were the creatures technically engineered for force manipulation.
Coucou William, sérieusement, je suis partie sur un strike que je l'ai plus. Qui m'avait protégé de mon frère.
Which would usually be in the form of a modified rainbow. And technically, even the Sith temples, tombs, and many other structures are considered to be architectural, but also alchemical works. Pieces of technology that channel dark side energy through the architecture. This take forms as varied as the pyramidal structures on Korriban to the Sith meditation
Ouais, j'en ai fini. Bon, fouiller les machines de façon, lesquelles enregistrent. Ok.
Like their own biology that work to feed off and amplify the dark side. These structures would act in the same way. And of course, this led them to realize that one could use these same principles of weapons and structures to make super weapons,
William?
whether it be temples that can unleash enormous amounts of energy, or ships that can make a star go supernova. Now all these power struggles between the tribal circles over Korriban did eventually consolidate into larger and larger circles, and then a strict caste system within each. And over the years, they developed physical differences to the point that many consider each caste to be its own subspecies. The highest ranking were the Kasai, the priest caste that would lead their followers in the Sith magics and alchemy. Manatees have elongated tentacles on the face and a slightly longer lifespan than the other castes at around 60 years. This was followed by the Ziggurat, the engineers that actually constructed the burial mounds, temples, weaponry, and later starships. The Ziggurat are where we see the most variation in 5 fingers and darker skin color. Then there was the warrior class, the Masasi. They varied the most, more tendrils covering the body, being on average a whole meter taller than the priestly class, having completely yellow eyes, and being overall more beast-like in general. They were much less intelligent than the higher castes, but of course much stronger. They make up the bulk of the armies of the Sith, both on-world and as they expanded out through the stars. It is unclear when the Sith first became a spacefaring race, but they did achieve this independently, not basing their tech off of some other advanced physics. Once they found other
C'est
worlds,
déjà
they were quick
quitté,
to conquer them
William.
and add a new lower levels in their castes, now having an abundance of slaves. The word for them was the insult, Rothman, and most of the slaves would be from the Purglic, Mercy, and human species. Though some were Sith that fell into this role as well. These were hated more than the alien slaves, being pathetic insults to the dark side. Through their weakness, they revered the Sith lords as gods. All these slaves would be used to construct the ever-growing tomb complexes and fleets. And when a Sith Lord died, all of their slaves would be buried alive with them on Korra. With the Sith now growing their first small empire in the Outer Rim, we
On
come to
peut
contact
t'avoir
with the
volé
Salut
mon
species,
affaire, mon chien
one
sale.
of the closest things to vampires, living extremely long lives and drawing blood from their victims. And they and the Sith species had a mutual respect for each other. We think the Sith blood soup, a concoction whose ingredients are still not really known, but presumably must have rejuvenated the drinker or given them a deeper connection with the Force. By the year 36,453 BBY, though Yor, the pyramidal ships that were sent out by the Force to collect Force-sensitive individuals from around the galaxy and bring them to Titanor, landed on Korriban and transported some members of the Sith species. These Force wielders from various species would form the Jedi Order, which eventually became the Jedi Order. Meanwhile, back on Korriban, the Sith were experiencing the most intense fighting in their history. The tribes all fighting each other for thousands of years until it was ultimately brought under a single ruler. King Addis would wield his powerful war axe, but most of his kills were earned through his incredible use of Sith magic. He would unify all of Korriban, forcing all the castes to worship him as a god, and eventually take the title of Sithari, or perfect being, the divine dark side of the incarnate. His unholiness would rule for 300 years as the absolute ruler of all Sith, until these people saw their first real challengers in the form of the Okada. Their infinite empire was the greatest the galaxy had ever seen, one which also ran off of dark side energy. Posing as dark side allies, it would teach the Sith several new technologies like the hyperdrive, but also the holocron. The Sith holocron was a crucial method to transfer dark side wisdom over the eons. After the Rakata had worked their way into the Sith Lord's inner circle, they launched their invasion,
I'm gonna
taking
live with
Ratner,
George.
the court magician, captive, and neutralized him by isolating his
Oui,
consciousness
meurt,
in
mon chien
Rakata's
sale.
mind train. When the technologically superior forces spread over Korriban, Addis would take up his battle axe and lead the charge to defend the Sith homeland. The battle would see Rakata machines destroyed by talismanic weaponry, Sith spawn beasts, and dark side magic, delivering a shocking defeat to the Infinite Empire, chasing them off-world, and forcing them to abandon some of their crafts. With these
Salut, c'est le
hyperdrives, the Sith could
message.
finally expand their empire. And King Addis would die in the capture of these ships, though this battle did help to secure the future of his people. As soon as the king died, the Sith reverted to the fractured tribal warfare, all hoping to become the next Titan, forcing some Sith to decide to take these alien craft and
Oh,
colonize the galaxy,
YouTube est
quickly
parti.
establishing a settlement on Zion. The priestly Kasai class
Oui,
would
je
lead
m'en fous.
Korriban as the fighting grew out of control, with warriors all declaring themselves the Sith Lord, and prophecies of a new Sithari that was destined to return and unify them spreading throughout the people. Even more turmoil broke out amongst the priests,
J'avais mon
with
fond.
some seeing the death of Aedis and the actions of the dark side of the Causes as
J'ai
proof
baissé
that
mon
this way of
fond de
connecting
là.
with the Force was impure. We would focus on a new concept, unity, the mix of that other mysterious and strange side of the Force, known as the light
Weird.
side. We pondered if
It's
they had
right
been wrong in
there.
focusing on and amplifying the dark, and using
I
things
am
priests
looking for
marked the
my
first
cell
recorded
phone.
written history of the Sith species. Though these priests would be exiled from their caste, forced out to the planet Sun. Over the centuries, Zios would become the new capital of the Sith Empire, with 4 abandoned inhabitants killing themselves off in such numbers that they eventually settled into the role of caretakers for the tomb complex. While the most prominent Sith were now on Zyos, they would all return to Korriban for important rituals and to be buried in the ever-expanding valleys.
How can I call a cell phone?
And by 14,000 BBY, they would set up the Sith Library Temple on Graces too. This was similar to the Jedi Library in Amusons, but here they would further delve into the dark arts and experimentation on the Sith's followers and alchemical devices. About 6 millennia later, in 8,000 BBY, a group of Republic citizens were making it into space for the first time. But because hyperspace navigation was so difficult, they never encountered the growing empire of this area. Another 1,000 years would pass.
Completely vanished.
Who rose to power, claiming to be the
How can a cell phone vanish?
2/3 of Korriban for over 50 years. A time which the Sith species remembers as one of the most brutal
I
and
did
tireless.
this.
With Flash's sadism and terror hitting peaks that shocked even this dark
Didn't
side
fall
species.
in my
At the
purse.
same time, there was growing turmoil within the Jedi Order over Republic states. Many of their Force wielders were noticing that there was a wide
Didn't
array
fall
of
on the
useful
ground
abilities
either.
and as the Jedi tried to look into them further, their masters tried to suppress knowledge, even shame
It's
those
right
who took
there.
interest. Eventually, these Jedi would try to shake off their oppressive masters. They were deemed Dark Jedi by those that
I
forced them
don't
into
get
exile.
it.
This resulted in a civil war known as the Second Great Schism, a conflict that would set the
My
tone for
cell
the
phone
rest of galactic
completely
history. As
vanished.
over the next thousands of years, there would
I've
be
gotta go
countless trillions
here.
of individuals from each and every species that would be dragged into the never-ending civil war between the Force wielders. And this
C'est quoi
particular
qui
war
va
would last for over a
Ah,
century.
I
More and
mean,
more Jedi were turning to the dark. But the
okay, well,
Orthodox
I'll
Jedi were
have to
still
look
more
for it
numerous and eventually
later.
forced to surrender at the Battle of Corpus. The Jedi would
Bizarrement,
not
il
execute
est
these prisoners, but also could not let them run amok in the Republic. They decided on exile,
disparu.
packing all of the
Let's go,
Dark
madame.
Jedi into a drone ship that contained no weaponry,
Pretty sure you
no
were on
navigation,
it.
and then firing them off into the most obscure part of the Outer Rim. No
C'est pas
civilization
bon
had
ça.
ever been recorded in this
Oups.
area of space. No means
Je
of
vais
these fallen
déménager.
ones to grow to power. Hopefully they'd be too busy trying to survive in such a sparse, inhospitable region to keep playing with their dark arts.
Je sais pas.
But of course, as the
Je
Force
vais
would have
changer
it,
de
the
place.
ship was on a course for the nexus of the dark side itself. All
It's
the
right
trajectories it
there.
could have taken. It glided
I don't
right
know
from
if
the
you
orbit
guys
of
can
Korriban,
see it,
and then guided right down to the surface on the home
but
of the
it's
Sith.
right
When the Dark
there.
Jedi emerged, they were stunned to sense a connection to the dark
Can I
side.
have one
Each
viewer?
minority species
Yay!
today, having been taught that Force connection was incredibly
It's
rare,
getting
and that the
there.
dark side
Let
was
it fall
unnatural
down.
to be shunned. The locals
Ok.
greeted them with violence and displays of powerful Sith magic.
Oh, j'ai pas eu le temps de faire les 15
Illusions that these
enregistreurs.
trained lifelong Jedi were able to
I
work
got
through.
killed.
But recognize that these techniques were
Quickly.
incredibly different from the way they were trained by light
Elle me
side
donne pas
who
chance.
could battle in the darkness. Lightsabers and Sith weaponry would flash.
On
They
va essayer
remembered
un
the
autre
lessons of their
personnage
forgotten
après.
alliance 10,000 years earlier, denying all attempts at sharing technology and methods, waging a total war on these aliens, only to be outsmarted and increasingly brought under the heel of these Dark Jedi. Even when defeated, the Sith were adamant not to give up their rituals and talismans, but eventually, through their own Force manipulation, using the
Too
Sith to
funny.
betray each other, they were able to break enough sorcerers to learn how to wield the dark side like a true Sith. The Shadow Hand, the second in command to Brash's descendant and the reigning king, came to see that these Gen Jedi, as the Sith called them, were not going to be stopped. He betrayed his king, and helped Dark Jedi enter the wall to secure the battle in which the Sith who sat on the
On va changer de
ancestral throne of
personnage
King
après.
Hast's authority would be beheaded and replaced
I've
by
got a
a
viewer
Dark
from
Lord, who now took the
YouTube.
title
I'm so
of the
happy.
Dark Lord of the Sith.
It's always
Innumerable generations
0.
raised within the strict caste system. The Sith were
Mais là, je suis
kept to follow
rendue
a
à
line and eventually worship the
330,
Magic Ball as a symbol
je crois.
to expand the alchemical and magical abilities, and was sure to bring the rest of the Sith Empire under his rule. He too would have Zyos as the capital of the Empire, and Korriban as the mystical center. The Dark Jedi would use their knowledge of the galaxy at large to expand their fleets and conventional weapons, while taking the creation of structures and Sith spawn beasts to new heights. The Dark Lord focused on growing an army with the Masasi Sith as foot soldiers, wielding the most advanced form of alchemical and technological weapons. Some of the Dark Jedi were itching to strike back at the Republic and had sent them off to die. They were able to figure out a path back to Republic space and launched a raid on the Jedi in hopes of using
Je
the new
sais pas.
arsenal of dark powers to take over the galaxy. This mission was not approved of by the Lord. It was seen as a foolish, premature reveal of their forces. All it accomplished was to tip the Jedi off to the existence of the Sith. But their enemy could
Please
not
don't
tell
let
from
me
whence,
die that
only
soon.
that this old wound was festering somewhere in the outer rim. Back in Sith space, the Dark Jedi had made a discovery that would change the species forever. Starting with the Masasi class, they
On fait toutes les
experimented by
mêmes
using
quests, puis c'est
alchemical
ça qui
means to
m'énerve.
create offspring that were a mix of their human blood and Sith blood. It worked. It created a being that was more calm, intelligent, and calculated, and still with the intense, direct biological connection with the dark side. This was expanded to the priestly Kasai class, and over the next 2,000 years, these hybrids completely replaced the upper castes, and then most of the Sith population. Over this time, the Sith Empire was expanding as well, taking hundreds of worlds, including Zoltar-Koss, Cardelva, Rel, coming into contact with the Tomb, reconnecting with the pure-blooded Sith that were exiled here ages earlier. Then they also established a greater presence on Malachor 5. And as is the nature of the dark side and those attracted to it, the local leaders were constantly undermining each other for any advantage, resulting in countless civil wars that tried to overthrow the reign of Sith Lord. This helped to stop the spread of the Empire overall, as there was already plenty of wealthy planets to fight over. This turmoil helped to create a string of the most powerful lords to ever live. Starting in 5100 WY, he defeated a rival Sith Lord named Simus, and would usher in what was referred to as the Golden Age of the Sith. For 100 years of unprecedented stability and growth. He was a half-breed Sith who was able to pit all of the rivals against each other, but two stood out. The Sith Lord Udo Kresh and his rival Naga Sadao. Kresh wanted to simply consolidate power in Sith space and delve deeper into the mysteries of the dark side, while Sadao felt that it was time to take wars with the Republic. Naga Sadao was actually proud to claim that he was mostly a, quote, Jedi blood. He saw this golden age as one of dull stagnation. At the funeral for Martha Ragnos, these two contestants to the title of Sith Lord would call in their armies and fight to the death, and neither could defeat their enemy.
Ok, ça
At a break in the
enregistre
fighting,
sur
the
le
spirit of
photo.
Ragnos rose up from the tomb to speak to the Sith, laying out their long history and his aims of the Golden Age,
Je vais
but
faire avec
ended
le
by saying that the
ciel.
future of the Sith was in their hands. That they must choose wisely between isolation and expansion.
Voilà.
This decision could forever change the Sith. Just as the spirit faded back into the tomb, they spotted a craft descending through the clouds. It was a ship containing a pair of explorers that set out for Republic space. The two humans were quickly thrown in restraints and hauled off to a prison in Zionis. Naga Sadao knew this was his chance to expand. While his rival Kresh and the entire Shadow Council all agreed that the Republic explorers should be executed, Sadao was secretly orchestrating their escape, framed a murder on their exit, making the whole thing look like a Republic strike team rescue mission. The Council was convinced and backed the bellicose Sadao, who was eager to get revenge on the invaders. Kresh sensed trickery, and though he was able to split the Sith for a time, Sadao was able to defeat his forces and unify the people. All the while, his human pawns
Ok,
made
ça
their way back
enregistre
to
aussi
Coruscant,
complet.
and his ship continued a tracking device. The invasion would be launched via the Daracon
Ok.
thread, moving all their forces at once and setting up a forward base in the system of Prime Discovery. An area controlled by Empress Teta was assaulted to test one of Naga Sadao's strategies. The Republic military numbers were far greater than the Sith fleet, but through sorcery they were able to maintain large-scale illusions of Sith craft, working to crush morale, cutting off escapes and forcing surrenders, guiding the battles to take place where the Sith generals wanted. These illusions providing much of the advantage of superior numbers without needing to fire a shot or even engage the enemy. With this strategy, they would press on to take the crucial Republic shipyards at Boros, and then on to Coruscant itself. Sith Lord Shar Khan would lead the push up the steps of the City Hall. Sadao's meditation sphere would be discovered and fired upon, breaking his connection. These illusions generated via the potent mix of Sith alchemical architecture and Sith magic coursing through the ship. Once the Republic could identify the true Sith forces, they were able to focus their attacks around the invaders. The Sith then turned all of their efforts to taking over Emperor space,
J'ai survécu
eventually
longtemps.
through massive Jedi sacrifices and poison gas attacks, as well as additional Republic allies showing up. The Sith were finally routed completely, forcing them to regroup at Platinus Goldo with Sadao and his meditation sphere. The Lord of the Sith realized that defeat could not be avoided and sent the Sith fleet to jump back to Corvette. They made sure to leave the Republic apart again, making the sun go supernova. From one war to another, as soon as they returned to Sith space, they were right back in the civil war with Kresh's forces. After a skirmish on Corvan between these two claimants to the title Dark Lord, the battle would move to their fleets. Massive amounts of Sith assets destroyed fighting against each other, with Sadow's beleaguered fleets taking the most damage, seeming on the edge of total defeat before he sent a ship to crash into Fresh's flagship. Their military decimated by both the Republic and Sith, Fresh's own men decided to kneel to Sadao, preserve what was left of the Sith Empire. A crucial decision, as Empress Sadao had been able to figure out a path through the Darabon Trail, and emerged in Sith space leading a Republic fleet to finish them off. Sadao orchestrated a retreat and brought the enemy in pursuit near multiple star systems, using his dark arts to make the sun go supernova. The Republic fleet was suffering too many losses to pursue, and the Empress decided to call it off, leave the ragged Sith fleets to die off under their own leadership. Surely an empire that would sacrifice their own star systems and burn out like these supernovae. The great hyperspace war was over. The Republic did not forget about this threat. It gradually returned to slowly and systematically dissect the Sith Empire, eventually conquering all of Sith space, taking their colonies, their 5 spiritually significant worlds, and trying to dismantle or cover up the countless talismans and artifacts they discovered, all reeking with dark side energy. It was believed that the Sith species had gone extinct, and that their dark beliefs had died off with them. While the Jedi studied the relics of the fallen Sith Empire, the survivors were spread throughout the galaxy, and even outside of it, all plotting their return. Some were units that were lost during the war, who became the gods of primitive populations like the Bashir. Others built their power on Yule and Rule, while Naga Sadow himself was with the remainder of his forces in a single starship. He decided to put down on the moon Yavin 4, as Massassi would construct enormous temples to be used in dark rituals. It was also still the settlement on Toon of the pure-blooded Sith. Overall, in this time, their Force practices were vastly different from the Sith Corps. Known as the Sorcerers of Toon, they pushed into the darkness of the Force in a way unlike Sith or Jedi, allowing them powers of phantasms, strength mortification, and thaumaturgy. Cambria, a Sith sorceress, made the natives construct a massive black obelisk for her dark rituals, which eventually proved to channel more power than she could handle. The Force energy of souls lost here over millennia all burst through to turn the world into a lifeless desert. Race wars would break out between some Sith populations, mainly over cash. This lost tribe of Sith pitted human mix versus the so-called Red Sith. Eventually, the full-blooded Sith remained extinct during this war. While many other disparate Sith groups had all come to fall under the rule of one mysterious group that escaped the madness of Sadao and the Republic fleets. To stay alive and untrackable, their fleet made regular hyperspace jumps to randomized coordinates. With this process, they came upon the Chiss ascendancy in the unknown regions. They tried brute force to subjugate the blue-skinned aliens. The Chiss surprised them by offering to be allies. Roughly 20 years later, the Sith would rediscover their lost world of Dromon, and the Chiss were the very first official allies of the new Sith Empire. 4,400 BBY, Dark Jedi freed and mad would seek out the treasures of the lost Sith sorcerers. They came to Yavin 4, discovering the alchemically altered Massassi slave descendants that worshipped Naga Sadow as a god. He made his way into the chamber where the once leader of the Sith Empire entombed his spirit in suspended animation. The head would become the Sith's apprentice. Once he learned all he could, he fought and destroyed the spirit. And with the holocrons of King Aenus and Darth Dedu, he founded his own empire. Then 400 years later, Exar Kun would travel to Yavin 4, also in hopes of discovering the esoterics of rituals that were preserved in the temples. Massassi swarmed him, destroying his ship and bringing him to the great Sith Temple of Fire to be consumed by the Massassi blood sacrifice ritual. The god that they summoned was an old Sith world, once created through Sadow's alchemy. When he killed the demon, the Massassi saw him as a god, worshipping him and following his orders to construct more temples to focus the dark side energy. Runa practices alchemy on the Massassi priests, and then created great warrior servants alongside him. He took these to confront Dark Jedi Makito and Yula Caldroma, and when they fought, the ancient Sith amulets they wore had a connection to Marka Ragnos, whose spirit emerged to decide the fight, proclaiming that Exar Kun was the Dark Lord of the Sith and Caldroma the apprentice. This apprentice would lead a strike against his old Jedi masters on Coruscant, only to be captured and brought before the Senate. Kun would deploy a fleet of thousands of Massassi soldiers to rush into the Senate chamber. And the Sith fleet was an ancient ship used by Sadao, which was using its old trick of setting stars to supernova, drawing Republic fleets to rush to engage them in a bomb cluster. This move was ripping apart the Sith fleets as well. After Kuhn escaped
No
Coruscant,
music
he
on
raided
the
Amusons, was
stream.
able to enter priceless Jedi artifacts and weapons of the Sith. From here he would return to the Yavin 4, his apprentice betrayed him, all back for the light and gave the position of Jedi who had culminated in the full light of the Republic was descending on. Return to the old rituals to create an immortal spirit that could still dwell in this plane. Some Masasi would be sent off-world to be preserved, but thousands of these servants would be sacrificed in the dark ritual that created spirit. For the Jedi's creation of a wall of light-side energy worked to seal the spirit over the temple. In the decades that followed, Masasi that were sent off to the Yavin lived very diverse lives. Some would use this new freedom to pursue mundane lives, while others fought a life of revenge through the Sith, realizing that they had been manipulated and ultimately created as a slave race. While some did also survive the ritual of Yavin and continued to maintain their temples. The Jedi would make contact with the sorcerers of time, cautious at first, but recognizing that these Sith species were not the same belief. There was one Karnak Tetsu who saw himself as a prophet, wanted to turn them deeper into the dark. After he was defeated, that was the only issue they ever had with the Jedi Order. The Jedi eventually gave up trying to convert them, and just sent occasional emissaries to check in over the next several thousand years. The Kasai and Masasi castes on Korriban were still in enough abundance to maintain sites, though they had been mostly abandoned over centuries. Roman Kos was the capital of the Sith Empire, which all this time was still being secretly rebuilt. Ever since the Great Hyperspace War, this Sith Emperor Tenebrae, also known as Darth Vishi, had used his unparalleled power on the dark side to extend his life over thousands of years, slowly building up generations of devotees to his vision of the Sith Empire. This empire would turn its back on the species that gave them their name, and much of the empire was human, though the Emperor himself and many of the high-ranking positions for those of Sith hybrids, descendants of those that were created by the mixing of Dark Jedi exiles and the Kasai priests. A bit of propaganda is that these beings were called Sith purebloods at this time. Circa 4,000 BBY, these were far from the original Sith species, and it reflects these beings recognizing that their red-skinned side was long extinct, not numerous enough to be substantial even in the empire that used its name. Although some believe that this term pureblood represented their belief that this alchemical union between human and Sith helped to purify the offspring's blood, taking out the weakness of each species and create a perfect race. The reborn Sith Empire would take much of the other rim, and launch a galaxy of 1,300 years after the Great Hyperspace War, the Empire emerged to conduct 28 years of brutal invasions from countries known as the Great Galactic War, starting in 3,681 BBY with the retaking of Korriban. Somewhat symbolic of this change in species control is that this battle would see the Sith-descended Vindicant killed by his younger human apprentice Malgus. The war would end with the triumphant sacking of Coruscant, delivering more damage to the cities and Jedi temples than any other force in that era. The planet was smoldered, and Supreme Chancellor had been executed by Darth Vader, forcing the Republic to sign the Treaty of Coruscant. The Cold War era that followed, the Empire started to
Les
allow
12 signes dernièrement.
Dark Arts on Korriban,
Patrick
bringing
m'a
up
dit
any force
coup.
sensitives they found in the
Tu l'as
Empire,
signé
even if
ton
they were enslaved.
CDI?
This was found to be
C'est
distasteful
pas
to
ici
the Seers of
de
Korriban,
jouer un jeu
but this did help
électronique
the
toute
Empire
la
keep up
journée?
with the
Non.
civilization of Korriban.
Non, c'est après
Following
mes heures de
Anya and the
travail. Je
purebloods,
veux pas que je
literal
joue à
religious
des jeux.
hybrids became further diluted and killed off, leading to
Après
a
mon journée de
devastation
travail,
that
je
no
viens
notable
m'amuser.
communities could exist.
Je décompresse en jouant à des jeux vidéo.
From relics to language were spread across the galaxy, influencing the lives and culture
Et
of
dernièrement,
the
je l'ai tellement
greatest
pas.
legacy would be the word Sith itself, being synonymous with the dark side, and in layman used in everything from an insult, like Sith skin, to a general description of evil, and especially anyone who used supernatural means to be described as a Sith. Even some Jedi were assumed to be Sith in the Empire. And of course, the Jedi Order never forgot about the Sith. The new Sith Wars were fought against the
Encore?
Brotherhood of Darkness, which operated as Sith
Non, mais il
Academy
n'y en
on
avait pas.
Korriban, which would raise Darth Bane. Bane thinking that the Sith species was long extinct. In the year 45 BBY, some
C'est bien.
refugees of the Tomb species set down the Sith sorcerers' role at Tomb, and when they were
J'ai
chased
dit, je
off,
changerai
they
mon
defected
numéro.
the Senate, and
Ah,
Palpatine was
merci
quick to
Patrick.
degrade the
Bienvenue dans la
Supreme
famille.
Justice, warning that these people should be isolated and no travelers go near them.
Je suis pas la meilleure des joueurs, mais je m'améliore depuis le nombre de mois que je joue. Je pense que ça fait 4-5 mois que je joue.
Funny enough, one full-blooded original Sith species returned made his way to Coruscant, where he got by using his knowledge to create magic
Tu
shows
passes
and
toujours pas?
poke
Oui, je travaille à l'hôpital.
This may have inadvertently
Je suis un
preserved the
employé de
species,
soin.
because all of the sorcerers of time were burned away by the green fire of an electromagnetic torpedo.
Je comprends pas qu'est-ce que tu faisais faire ton CDI.
He was training with them until he learned all of their secrets, or dubbing himself the sorcerer of doom, putting an end to this outpost colony of Sith exiles that had lasted for
Mais c'est un double revenu
There
faire
was
ça.
one last ray of hope that shot out across time itself. 41 years after the Battle of Yavin, a ship named the Harbinger popped out of hyperspace, some 5,000 years after it entered the Blue Void. The ship's hyperdrive was damaged by a Jedi's attack during the Great Hyperspace War.
Non,
Hey,
c'était
you
bien,
know
oui.
before, there was the
Bon, on va
Alpha
plein.
attack. It
On
was
est trop
commanded by
proche.
Sage Rogan, a leash who was leading a platoon of Massassin warriors. Perhaps they could have revived this subspecies of the Sith. The Jedi Knight Jaden Korr was able to board the ship, kill the captain, and use the volatile ore to destroy the ship and have it explode on a nearby hill, killing everyone on board.
On va
The
voir.
Sith's impact on the galaxy is the greatest of any single species, rivaled perhaps only by the humans.
Là, j'arrange
Amongst
que
the
mes
surface,
messages sont
somewhere
plus
amongst
hauts.
the stars, there is some
Check
outpost of Sith beings. Because as history shows, they have proven to appear out of the darkness countless times when others believe them vanquished from the galaxy, always finding a way to return, much like the infamous Sith Order itself. So that's it for the Sith species, but you definitely want to hear these full packs if you haven't seen some. There are tons of references to real-world concepts around evil and the devil, almost obvious
American Sith.
also things like them being left-handed is a reference to biblical artists
American
right
Sith.
hand of God versus your left. The fact that the Yavin temples channel dark side energy is a reference to Christian accounts of Mayan temples, and real-world evidence is the Baal or Allah. There are also a lot of human sacrifices within Mayan culture, just like within the South Pacific, tons of depictions of which can be found in the cult. Many believe that there are real-world equivalents to the magics and alchemical creations just like the Sith. This is the perfect time to give a warning from a Sith practitioner and the real-world most interesting man to read. You'd have a deep interest in the cult.
Have met people who claim to be Satanists, who claim to be involved with black magic, who claim that they knew a lot about it. And as I said, I've said that they were involved in war or people attending the news or minds or so.
Extra details come from the complete encyclopedia, Old Republic encyclopedia, Essential Guide to Warfare, and a ton of different comics. If you made it this far, please help out by hitting that like button and leaving a comment. Let me know if you learned anything new, add something I might have missed, and make a suggestion for a future video. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss videos like this. Check out the description below for links to cool Star Wars metal print arts and free audible audiobooks, as well as our Patreon and PayPal. Especially our $25 tier supporters, Chris Garcia, Cass Costello, C7 Go, Matthew Beltrami, Sarah Cleans, and Bill Finney. But most important of all, remember, whether it's the endless wars and backstage, experimenting on and sacrificing their own, trusting the wrong outsiders, or blowing up their own stars, nobody's as good at destroying the Sith as the Sith. And the Force will be with you, always. Here is why you cannot exterminate us, our AT. We're not huddled in one place. We span the galaxy. We need no lords or leaders, so you cannot destroy our command. We can live without technology, so we can fight with our bare hands. We have no species or bloodline, so we can rebuild our ranks with others who want to join us. We're more than just a people or an army, our AT. We're a culture. We're an idea. And you can't kill ideas, but we can certainly kill you. What's up, nerds? This is essentially a documentary on the Mandalorians, or as they're called in their own language, the Mandalorians. meaning the children of Mandalore. Like that quote mentions, the Mandalorians aren't a species, but a culture. We'll get into their origins, their history, how they did start as a specific species, but ended up being mostly humans. Notable Mandalorian across history, and their constant and important role as a third-party wild card in galactic affairs. The story starts around 24,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, when the Tong species were entrenched in a war of elimination against the Zell. These Zell are the human natives of Coruscant. They had been fighting the Tong for centuries. When a volcano erupted and leveled the humans' capital, the Tong saw a chance of victory, launching intense raids over the next 2 years. As Coruscant was plunged into total darkness, the atmosphere full of volcanic ash. The Tong's terrifying raids would be immortalized in a poem that is still known throughout the galaxy, called The Wind of Earth, The Warriors of the Shadow. The Tong's whole culture revolved around war, with the society being loosely assembled warrior clans that all followed their chieftains. They would give their children names like Akin, Kant, and Tor, meaning persistent, strength, and justice. While their gods reflected this warlike nature as well. Todd Harangir is a god who used conflict to improve the world. Survival of the fittest both in your own behaviors, your family, but also in the world around you. The idea that competition was a way to accelerate natural selection, and thus war is applied on a massive scale, eventually a galactic scale. Note that in this, there is no concept of morality as we would conceive of it on Earth. With them, surviving is equated with food, and that process is a good in itself. Conquering in this culture has the equivalence of happiness or well-being in most Earth cultures, things that philosophically and religiously are usually considered to be goods in themselves. We don't ask why someone would prefer to be happy. Likewise, the Tong would have not understood why they had to explain why combat was preferable to peace. And further to this point, the opposing god in their duality is not a devil that corrupts the once spread misery. The Tong god that needs to be resisted was Arasu, a sloth god who tempted those to live a life of stagnation and idleness. If the Sith mantra reads, peace is a lot, we could think of these early Mandalorians as believing that peace is a sin. This was enshrined in a body of text called the Canons of Honor, which had within it the Resinare, meaning the 6 actions, as well as commentaries from wise Tong chieftains. A notable quote reads,
I have used the Resinare, the core of what it means to be Mandalorian, the sacred law giving us direction and purpose. Education and armor, self-defense, our tribe, our language, our leader, all help us survive. We must educate our children as Mandalorians, obey the commands of Mandalore, speak Mandoa, and defend our clans.
Here's where the Mandalorian armor was enshrined as something to keep holy, and forever tied to being one of the Mandalorian, symbolizing the keeping of these virtues. The Tong armor had this metal helmet that was more fitting upon the triangular heads, and you can see how this early armor that accommodated the roof of the eyes and the pointed jaws remained a hook in the helmets even as it changed over tens of thousands of years. But despite this war culture, the original human Coruscanti simply outnumbered the Shadow Warriors. They were eventually able to push the Tong off the home world. At this point, there is a split, where a peace-loving sect of priestly female Tong fled Coruscant to the unknown regions. But the majority of them went to the planet Rue in the Outer Rim. This was the darkest moment in the history of Mandalorian culture, literally due to the so-called Cloak of the Sith, a thick layer of cosmic dust that shrouded this planet, but also because of its stay here following in obscurity and weakness for about 17,000 years. The year 7000 DBY would see the rise of Tesola Mandalore, or Mandalore the first to use the title Sole Ruler, translated to Mandalore. He would become the chief of all chieftains and form the Mandalorian Crusaders, a force that spread out, conquering world after world in the Outer Rim. They eventually came across the planet in Sector 07. They had plenty of fresh water and farmable land, but also an incredibly unique material called Beskar. This form of iron ore contained elements that could withstand multiple blows from lightsabers, and yet was malleable enough to be crafted into armor. It seems the war god had blessed their return to conquering with this perfect world to become the capital of the Mandalore Empire, and it was thus named Mandalore. The only problem was the native population. Mythosaurs were enormous beasts that ruled this world, creatures that would scare away most other settlers, were instead seen by the Mandalorians as proof that this world was reserved for the ultimate warriors. Mandalore I and his crusaders extincted the Mythosaur, and left their bones out in the open for all to see how large and numerous their foes were. The creature's skull would become synonymous with the strength of the Mandalorians. It would become one of the most well-known and respected sigils across the galaxy for thousands of years to come. Over the next 3,000 out from Mandalore to capture nearby Ordo, Garvon, and Shogun, while also developing Mandalore's moon, Cordia. But during this time, they were undergoing a sort of religious revolution over these thousands of years of fighting. It came about that the Mandalore saw the old god Cad Varierrrr as not a true and separate entity that needed to be worshipped and special rites developed for him. This was in a way a form of idolatry, worshipping a construct instead of the act of war itself. It wasn't this god, but the whole universe that was created and developed by the act of dominating. A microscopic organism with a slight advantage over its competitors devours them. The forming of planets is a process of absorbing your neighboring space debris to make yourself larger. The black hole devours light itself, and yet still can be swallowed up by a larger black hole. The powerful conquering is a law of the universe. Therefore, the rituals to Cad Varierrrr were a distraction from this universal presence, the sort of will that is present everywhere in all things. So they realized that anyone who wages war itself was in tune with this divine plan. That combat was the one and only true form of worship. Not to some old god, but you personally were carrying out the divine will, and thus in that moment, you yourself were divine. Not only is this more sophisticated metaphysics, but it's a great way to rally up some more crusaders. With this mindset, they would carry on fighting and taking over, but interestingly, this is where we also see a non-Tong species brought into the Mandalorian fold. The first ever non-Tong Mandos were the Mandalorian giants. They were able to repel the Mandalorians, but loved the warrior culture so much that they adopted their culture. We're now in the year 4000 BBY, where the Crusaders were busy extincting the Nahuta species. But they did absorb many Escaloni slaves, but also destroyed the noble basilics. These were highly intelligent dragon-like species, and this conflict would be the first time that Mandalorians faced off against Jedi. The Order sent over some relief, but even this combined force could not stand up to the Crusaders. The Basilisks poisoned their own world to deny to the conquerors, but some were taken as slaves, while their machines, the Basilisk war droids, were captured and would become a staple of the Crusader military. From here, they launched an attack into the New Core, into the unstable Emperor's Teta system. They conquered a few worlds, which got the attention of Jedi Knight turned Sith warlord, Ulic Qel-Droma. Mandalore the Indomitable challenged him to a duel, where despite his war droid and Beskar armor, he was defeated and swore allegiance to Qel-Droma and his Sith master, Exar Kun. This marked the first Mandalorian-Sith alliance. This was during an event called the First Sith War, also known as the Great Shadow Crusades of the Mandalorian people, which was fought in a single year of 3,996 BBY. This new alliance launched a daring raid of the Republic shipyards over Boros. Here they attained as much as 300 starships. With this flotilla, they went directly to the Republic's capital, attacking the home of the original Mandalorians, Coruscant. They poured into Galactic City, or betrayed by their allies, the craft witch, Torpedo. She also abandoned Qel-Droma to the Jedi forces. Mandalore the Indomitable managed to escape and made it to Exar Kun on Yavin 4. Explaining the situation, the pair teamed up and personally raided the Senate building to rescue Droma. The witch was dispatched by the trio, and they decided to abandon Coruscant. Later attacks brought the Basilisks war droids up against the Beast Riders and Drexels of Onderon as they attempted to take the capital city of Isis. Onderon's moon Daxon is an orbit that places the two temporarily to turn back, which allowed the Indomitable to flee when the Republic forces responded to an invasion. His mount was shot down, and he plummeted into the thick jungle of its moon. Here, a swarm of beasts devoured the Indomitable. He had led the Mandalorians for so long that his distinct helmet became a symbol of the sole ruler. Without a Mandalore, many of the clans started to fracture, but the helmet was discovered by a Tong who had lived through that battle. He removed it and declared himself Mandalore the Ultimate. He realized that his people had been dragged into the witch's machinations, and vowed to restore the Mandalorians to the great warrior status they once held. On the planet Shogun, which years earlier had shown the Indomitable that the old gods were false, now gave Mandalore the Ultimate a vision of the Tong species going extinct. At this time, the Tong species made up the bulk of Mandalorians. It was them that kept hurling themselves at the Republic and the Jedi. But he knew that the Mandalorian values were not bound to the Tong species, so he formed the Neo-Crusaders. He traveled the galaxy, giving rousing speeches to those willing to embrace the martial principles. Humans were the most populous and widespread species in the galaxy. This is why the majority of these new Mandalorians were human. But there were also tons of Rhodians, Twi'leks, Gregorians, and Orestians. From this moment on, the term Mandalorian really started to become untied to its own species. Now it was more about control. About 20 years after the previous war, now 3,978 BBY, a pure-blood Sith species contacted Mandalorian the Ultimate and enticed him to search Sith ruins for insight into the future. This Sith was working for the mysterious Sith Emperor and used his powers in the Force to instill visions of Mandalorians conquering the Republic. Inspired by promises of victory, the Neo-Crusaders started to capture neutral territory, and in 10 years they controlled a larger area than all of the Hutt planets. The Ultimate appointed a man named Cassius to be the top military strategist, and he promptly accelerated the capture of more worlds. One of Fett's contributions was the standardization of armor, something that helped to create a more cohesive identity across the diverse species, and ensured that the galaxy at large knew when they were dealing with the Mandalorian. He also developed a dual-pronged economic assault, in which these captured neutral worlds deprived the Republic of imports, while the Mandalorians took the local population as slave labor and focused all of these planets' resources through the sole task of creating more weapons and ships for the eventual war with the Republic. This caused an inpouring of refugees that caused internal strife and economic pressures, compounding the weakness of losing the neutral worlds. Senators said that the Republic would only intervene if directly attacked. And all this time, the Ultimate had set up training grounds deep in the jungle of Daxon, the place where his predecessor had been devoured. These camps were one of the greatest embodiments of the culture, training against the very creatures that had felled their leader, lifting up the rank and file to a greater strength than the best among them just a generation before. In 3964, they sprang up from the secret camp and took Onderon, Banquo, and Taurus in a shocking blitzkrieg. Two Jedi named Revan and Malak became aware of some of the Mandalorian atrocities, some of which included the nuclear bombardments of entire worlds. These two Jedi refused to stand by, eventually leading Republic forces, pushing the Mandalorians back. He came across the helmet of a Mandalorian woman who opposed Fett's genocide, and upon donning it, he swore that he would not rest until the Mandalorians had been completely defeated. Revan's strategy worked to pull most of the Mandalorian forces to Malachor 5. Here, the Jedi leader had to draw on this world's immense dark-side energy in order to defeat Mandalore the Ultimate in a duel. After this, he activated the Mass Shadow Generator, which destroyed most of the Mandalorian fleets. Without their leader or a proper navy, they signed a peace treaty with the Republic. Malak worried about a rise of the Mandalorians, but Revan said simply, without the mask, they are nothing. A cold statement where he is acknowledging that he is destroying an entire culture simply by holding on to this mask. Depriving them of a leader, which will just lead to fracturing and infighting that will eventually erase the Mandalorian identity and history. The Republic destroyed most of their military infrastructure and completely eliminated the iconic Bessalus war droids. These once proud people tried to keep up their traditions, but were spread out across the galaxy, and often resorted to taking up odd jobs as hired guns. These informal groupings became known as the Mandalorian Mercs, with notable individuals like Boris Mendak achieving gladiatorial fame on Taurus and Geonosis, and Canderous Ordo becoming one of the most infamous mercs in the galaxy. But as the Force would have it, he crossed paths with Revan, who now understood that the Mandalorians were being manipulated into war by the hidden Sith Emperor. Revan gave the helmet to Ordo, and asked him to rebuild the Mandalorians into a proud people. He took the name Mandalore the Preserver. He met with what may have been the final remaining Tom in the galaxy. This being was dying, but explained that he was the rightful heir to Mandalore the Indomitable. The Ultimate had used Sith backing to take over. He begged that Ordo take his armor and reinstill some of the virtues from the canons of honor. Ordo would be the first non-Tom Mandalore, and he went back to their roots, growing a new following of Neo-Crusaders on the outpost of Daxon. These forces would go on to fight against the Sith Triumvirate, help the Onderon royal family, and even provide aid to the Republic. Mandalore the Preserver personally aided the reign of Darth Nihilus' flesh, even providing the explosives that were used to blow up the space depths. The next 300 years of Mandalorian history was foggy, but it was clear that Clan Ordo did not fully unify the Mandalorians. 3,601 BBY, the Sith Empire made a surprise return to the galaxy and looked for another Mandalorian puppet. The gladiator pits of Geonosis, there was a crowd favorite. It was the perfect combination of charismatic
today is a little bit better. Je
intelligence
joue un
agents
petit peu
and
mieux.
fixed, and
Je suis
plants in
rendu
the crowd that
quatrième,
started
c'est déjà
chanting
bon.
Mandalore upon each of his victories. This man seemed
Petit
invincible,
mise.
and many of the diaspora were
Yeah.
happy to call him their new leader.
Je
The
sais
Sith
pas si
revealed
je
themselves
descends
as allies and convinced him that it was in Mandalore's interest to blockade the hiding way, cutting off a major Republic supply line as the Empire expanded in the Outer Rim. Mandalorian cruisers were too powerful for a straight-up attack, so the Republic had to rely on blockade-breaking smugglers. To rally up his supporters, this puppet Mandalore announced the Great Hunt with Daxon to determine who would become his best warrior. Artis kept winning the trials, and in line with the old
Je
versions,
vais
challenged
les mettre
Mandalore to a duel in the gladiator pits of Geonosis. This
c'est
propped
parce
up
que j'ai
leader was
débordé
slaughtered,
des
and
choses.
Artis took the name Mandalore the Vindicated. His predecessor is only known in the history
Il me
books
semble que
as
j'en ai
himself,
acheté
Mandalore
une.
the Lesser. He was much more cautious of his Sith allies, but knew that the money and weapons allowed him to consolidate power.
Le joueur de
Again,
tennis.
not all respected the
Where is
centralized
she?
leader.
She's in
Splintered
blue.
groups like Dan Barad and the Terror Brigade launched attacks against both the Sith and the Republic. The Vindicated would be eliminated during the rise of the
Je
Eternal Empire,
pensais.
being killed by its former sky troopers. Death by droid was seen as immensely dishonorable. This whole conflict created a strong anti-droid sentiment that would stick in Mandalorian culture from here on out.
Il me faut juste
Boba
une
Fett
raquette
could have
de
chosen to
tennis
take on
pour
the
elle.
mantle, but he didn't want the responsibility. So instead, the infamous bounty hunter Shae Vizsla became Mandalore the Adventure. Previously, she had been allied to Darth Malgus, who assisted him in battles on Alderaan, and even against the Jedi Temple itself.
Foulée.
Now she would join the Outlander in the Alliance. The combination of Sith and Republic forces have realized how grievous a threat the organic-hating Gemini droids pose to the galaxy. After this ancient, eternal
J'ai
force
deux
is
autres
destroyed, there's
personnages.
relative peace for the next 1,000+ years. That is, until the new Sith Wars, spanning from 2000 BBY to 1000. This conflict with the Mandalorians fighting against their once allies, the Sith Empire. The reasons behind this are still shrouded in mystery, but everything points to the exchange of a lot of credits, supporting a
Ah
constant
ouais,
complaint by
des choses
Mandalorians in this era
là-dessus.
that their once righteous, holy crusades of violence in accordance with the laws of the universe have been forgotten. Now it was all just for treasure. Around this time is where we also get Mandalorian training master Chang raising a Jedi named Dirge. He adopted this odd creature and raised it in the ways of the Mandalorians, but eventually he abandoned the culture when he felt that they were merely hired guns. The pair were taken in by a cyberneticist who enhanced their strength and longevity in exchange for protection from the current Mandalore. During a raid on the lab, all were killed but Dirge, who was able to massacre the attackers and devoted his life to killing Mandalorians. Darth Bane would bring an end to the Sith Empire in the year 1000 BBY, and apparently, in order to ensure galactic peace, the Republic turned on the Mandalorians in 730 BBY. As the warlords were still not fully under the control of the Mandalore, the Republic invaded Mandalore itself. In fighting against rival planets allowed the Republic a total victory, with weapons used by both the Republic and the Mandalorians creating an enormous cataclysm, an environmental disaster that turned much of this rich world into the barren white sand deserts that now cover its surface. This is where we get the new Mandalorians, a faction with very contentious origins. Many believe that they were propped up by the Republic to coax them into abandoning their culture. New Mandalorians said that the canons of honor only lead to death and ruin, and strength could only come by working together, by peacefully partaking in the Republic system. What I find interesting is that many Jedi were said to be leading the assault, and the Darksaber may have been stolen by the Jedi Temple around 1000 BBY. The lore on the Darksaber is not clear, simply stating that it was stolen during the fall of the Old Republic. It is said to be around a millennia before the Clone Wars, which would have been when the Republic was heavily involved with the Sith Wars. Tare Vizsla, descendant of Mandalore the Adventurer Shae Vizsla, was the only Mandalorian to become a Jedi. He was able to temporarily unify his people, and so the Darksaber became the new sign of the Sole Ruler, replacing the role of the helmet. The total destruction of Mandalore is not a story the Republic can tell you. They and the Jedi definitely played a role. It wasn't solely the result of a civil war amongst clans. But whatever you think of that, it worked. These were now a pacifist people, devoting all of their energy to surviving in the domed Pure cities. The capital was Sundari, and the leaders came to take the names from other cultures. King, Queen, Duchess, no longer calling themselves the Mandalore. Those unable to give up the warrior code were sent to the moon of Concordia, and the sight of armor-wearing Mandalorians became incredibly rare on Mandalore. These few called themselves the Akali, or Faithful, and they did keep a leader that they called Mandalore, with the last named one being a genocidal maniac named Mandalore the Destroyer. He took over after his predecessor was killed by Dirge, still carrying out murderous raids against Mandos
Ok, il me
in the year
restait
100 before.
grimper à
Around
une
60
corniche dans
BBY,
les 5
just 28 years before the Battle of Naboo, the Mandalorian Civil War erupted. Those calling
Éliminer
themselves the
l'adversaire
true
avec un pistolet
Mandalorians were living by what
mitrailleuse.
they called the Super Commando Codex, a sort of revised chivalry which
Ouais,
stated
qu'est-ce
that it
que
is still
je
noble
pourrais
and
pas
morally
faire?
necessary to learn the martial arts, but that these skills should not be used to conquer the old survival of the fittest framework. Instead, they are for protecting the rights of individuals. But Tor Vizsla hated this bastard child of
So,
pacifists and old
ça m'a
martial
sauvé à
ideas.
capote
He
là.
formed a group called Death Watch.
Ça va être tout pour ce soir avec Fortnite.
Jasper Muriel was the leader of these true Mandalorians. Eventually, he and his forces were
On
pushed
va aller
off of
faire du
Mandalore to
Genshin.
the
J'ai
agricultural
plusieurs
world
jeux
of
que je suis obligée de
Mandalore.
faire à tous
Local
les jours,
police
dans le
force had a
fond,
position
des
called the
routines à
Journeyman
tous les
Protector,
jours.
and one of them allowed the true Mandalorian
C'est pour ça que
forces
je
to
marque
hide
jeux
out on
variés, puis
property.
je n'ai
And
pas
so they set
marqué
up camp at the
Fortnite.
Vet farm. Vizsla found
Ça
out that
marque
this man
toujours
was hiding
Fortnite,
Muriel
puis je
and
comprends pas
brutally
pourquoi.
interrogated him in front of the man's son. Mama Fett sprung up out of hiding and unloaded her blaster rifle into Death Watch troops. She was killed in the
Que ça
fighting,
prend
and
juste
his father
différents
ordered the
jeux
son
à
to run into the field.
s'ouvrir.
This 8-year-old Jango Fett was picked up by Muriel, who raised the boy as his own, teaching him the new ways of the Mandalorians. The fighting between these two factions would continue, spanning nearly 2 decades, and it also saw a 14-year-old Jango Fett and his dying adopted father in his arms, succumbing to wounds delivered by Vizsla.
Tu regardes
Jango was
encore
now
sur
considered
YouTube.
a Mandalore, and they started to
I
score
like
significant
you.
victories in 44 BBY. But Vizsla and Death Watch turned to political corruption when they couldn't win on the battlefield. They contacted the governor of Galatran to concoct a story of war crimes committed by the true Mandalorian forces. The Jedi Order gets involved and believed the claims that Fett's forces were killing political activists, including innocent women and
J'écrivais
children.
ici.
Count Dooku led a strike team to capture Fett, hoping to get to the bottom of these claims. But the Mandalore refused to be brought in on false claims. He knew that if he was removed for trial, Death Watch would certainly regain their strength. So Fett and the true Mandos opened fire. The shootout resulted in 11 dead Jedi, 6 of which were shot by Jango personally.
Ne m'accusez pas que je ne travaille pas. Je ne fais pas juste ça, streamer puis gamer. Je stream et je game pour le plaisir de le faire. Je suis une gamer. Qu'est-ce que je peux faire à minuit le soir en arrivant pour réveiller mon conjoint? Ben, je peux pouvoir gamer. C'est ce que je fais. Mais du monde qui juge comme ça sans même avoir une réponse à la question puis il s'est sauvé, c'est pas correct. Puis je ne me gênerai pas de le laisser à savoir s'il revient. Tu bosses toujours pas. Qu'est-ce que t'en sais? Ouais, j'ai fini Fortnite. Là, je fais mes routines sur Genshin Impact. Puis en même temps, j'étais après faire un débat qu'il y a un monsieur qui s'est... Patrick, qui a écrit des commentaires négatifs d'un sens en m'accusant à tort. Tu bosses toujours pas. Du coup, t'as l'air... Tu l'as signé ton CDI. C'est pas une vie de jouer aux jeux électroniques dans les journées, non. Toute la journée, non. Juste laisser savoir, je travaille en temps plein de soir dans un centre hospitalier et quand je termine à minuit le soir, j'aime me divertir en gamant. Et pourquoi pas streamer en gamant. Moi, c'est comme ça que je le vois. Fait que me faire juger à tort puis se sauver sans même avoir la réponse, c'est un pissou. Ah.
Then Jango established the Cuevadar, a group of 100 sergeants, 75 of which were
J'ai souvent de fausses accusations, ça porte des frustrations inutiles, surtout que tout le long, j'appelle ça de la jalousie. Moi, comme ça, je le vois comme étant de la jalousie.
But Death Watch sought out Dooku as an ally. They attacked a Republic cruiser and spread rumors on Confederate worlds that the new Mandalorians were actually supporting the Republic. This is why Obi-Wan was dispatched to the use of
Si
team.
t'as pas les moyens ou l'équipement pour pouvoir streamer, c'est pas mon problème. Mais j'ai le droit de jouer comme bon me semble après mes heures de travail.
Those trying to keep up the war-loving traditions. It was governed by previous they supported the introduction of weapons, jetpacks, and full suits of armor, all for the purposes of overthrowing the passive. This sparked a really controversial move by the Republic, who after learning that Death Watch had had grown and backing, sent a large piece of force. Many Mandalorians opposed this, seeing it as occupation, and proved that the Republic still believed that the Mandalorians
Moi, je trouve que c'est mon seul moyen de décompresser, de pouvoir décrocher du travail. Car c'est très exigeant de travailler dans un hôpital, surtout avec le code de COVID. Et ça nous demande beaucoup. La part d'équipement qu'on doit porter en surplus, on étouffe, on voit pas bien. T'as des lunettes, t'as de la steam des lunettes. C'est pas toujours aussi plaisant de travailler dans un centre hospitalier dans des situations comme celle-ci. Fait que me faire juger, amuse-toi. Mais tu connais pas ma vie.
A man who betrayed the Duchess simply because he didn't want to give up some of the imports that he loved. This decadence is a long way from the Spartan living of the earlier Mandos. This seed of corruption spread throughout the police force, and even the new Mandalorian
C'est certainement pas un membre.
Almec attempted to have Satine framed, but it
Non,
backfired.
je peux pas voir si c'est un membre. Puis-je voir de là? Non plus. Je peux ni le bloquer.
Lux Von Terry hoped to use their aid to help him avenge his mother, a peace-wanting separatist leader that had been killed by Dooku. Lux and Ahsoka were met by Bo-Katan and Free Vizsla, but they were unwilling to stand by as Death Watch committed atrocities, so the plan fell apart, but they do escape. Here, Death Watch found a new ally, who hated both the Republic and the Sith-led CIS. Darth Maul had been growing a criminal empire known as the Shadow Collective. By sending hordes of criminals to invade the capital, they were able to make Death Watch appear like the heroes. Free Vizsla publicly confronts the team and has her arrested. Vizsla would be the new Prime Minister of Mandalore, but not for long. Darth Maul knew his Mandalorian culture, and if Vizsla was going to usher back the old customs, he could not be seen to turn down a challenge to a duel. Fighting was intense, but Maul would win the battle, proclaim himself the new Mandalore. Bo-Katan and the Night Owl refused to submit, and so had to fight against Death Watch. Just layers of civil wars here. She was actually Satine's sister, who would come back to help Obi-Wan escape Maul's capture. Only after Maul used Satine to deal one of the hardest losses that Kenobi would ever experience, coldly killing the Duchess in front of him just to make his oldest enemy suffer. Things were so out of control that Sidious personally visited Anakin to cut down Maul's brother, then defeats Maul and takes him prisoner. To point out that throughout this incredibly volatile time, you can see that even the pacifists and Mandalorian artwork was embracing their past as warriors. His visions of the Crusaders even vanquished Jedi. Before he was captured, Maul had put Prime Minister Almec in as his puppet leader, and he would continue ruling while the Zabrak was imprisoned at Slave Prime. The Maul-Dalorians, the super commandos still loyal to him, freed Maul, and they returned to Mandalore. Due to the encouraging of Bo-Katan and Obi-Wan's personal testimony, the Republic agreed to siege Mandalore and take it out of the hands of a known Sith-trained crime warlord. If they were worried about the planet before, it doesn't get much worse than that. Ahsoka Tano had left the Jedi Order at this point, but she returned to lead a detachment of clone troopers during the siege. She confronts Maul and gets in one of the best barbs in galactic history.
Non, on joue pour le plaisir de jouer, pour se divertir, s'assurer un peu de la réalité aussi. Ça fait du bien.
Ahsoka says, it'll be a fair fight then. You're only half Sith. Pretty great stuff. Tano was able to draw Maul into
relaxant
motivation
après
and
le
trap,
travail.
and as his forces come to his aid, she was left with the choice of
Ça va comme
finishing
ma
Maul
routine
or
après le
saving
travail,
Rex.
c'est
She
une bonne
chose a
douche avant
longtime
de quitter
ally,
les lieux, bien
and
sûr, à
everyone
cause que
survived.
c'est un cas
But as the
COVID,
siege
je ne
carried
peux pas
on, he was
rapporter
eventually
ça à la
driven off
maison.
Mandalore, and Bo-Katan becomes the regent of Mandalore. This was probably the best shot in their history at a stable government.
Après,
They balanced
je
a good
mange, bien
military
sûr.
self-reliance embodying
On
a
parle un
peace-craving
peu
cult.
avec mon
But
conjoint avant
alas,
qu'il se
it
couche
wasn't
parce
the
que
dark
lui
saber
travaille
she
de
played
soir
with. During the
malheureusement.
Imperial era, she was
De
becoming
jour.
traitorous and replaced
Fait qu'on
with
se voit pas
assassins who were
énormément.
willing to do the Emperor's bidding.
Fait qu'on passe un peu de temps ensemble.
And vows to protect her from foes' death.
Puis après, ben, je m'amuse à venir aimer.
Once rallied to help to save the life of a young King Charles. After the war, Palpatine
Ça
allowed
me
the
fait
protectors to
complètement
consolidate
décrocher.
power in Mandalore space, with their main base being on a moon of Hong. Then Saxon converted itself into Imperial Mandalore, and in the year TDY, it wiped out the protectors. This ensured that his plan was the sole ruler of Mandalore, and that Palpatine's favor when it switched to Morale one day. Also that year, the Spectres discovered that Maul had been hiding the Darksaber, or
Ça fait du bien.
they recovered it, and encouraged Sabine to start training with it. Knowing
Je
the
joue à
immense
Final
responsibility of
Fantasy
training as well, she
XIV,
was reluctant, but
que
the
lui
now
me fait
rebel
tellement
aligned Background
décrocher.
supported her. She
C'est un
returned to
jeu
her
en
clan
ligne, bien sûr,
stronghold,
un
trying to get her
RPG.
mother to join the rebellion. Saxon
Si tu
arrives,
peux
and
faire
erupts an epic Mandalorian showdown that would make her ancestors
role-playing,
proud. With the Darksaber
j'en
in
fais
the
pas
hands of this
beaucoup,
sellout Mandalore,
mais je
Sabine was required to
m'imagine
fight
un
with
peu
this
comme une autre
lightsaber.
vie.
That was when the day, and Saxon dies. But this, of course, now dragged Mandalore into another
J'essaie de
civil war,
m'imaginer
with
que mon
Imperial
bonhomme
aligned
est
Mandos versus those set to join the
et
rebellion
moi.
remaining intact. Ron at this time was laying siege to Mandalore, and when Ezra is able to escape, he got some of Sabine's allies to provide help. This cannot be overstated, but the rebellion may have died this day, if it wasn't for the Mando strike team destroying the Interdictor, thus preventing rebel
Et
ships from
l'autre
jumping
qu'il
hyperspace.
faut que je fasse tomber.
Without this opening, Ron would have certainly killed all that remained. Sabine then tried to offer the Darksaber to Khan, but she thanked him. His pair, along with other allied clans, tried to push the Empire off Mandalore, but the Duchess failed. This prototype weapon was created by Sabine years before, when she was serving as an Imperial weapon designer. This insidious weapon draws arc energy to the Beskar alloy in the Mandalorian armor, allowing it to be used in the battlefield without hurting the stormtroopers and blast through armor. Knowing how inextricably tied armor is to Mandalorian culture, and how the discovery of
Mais je
Beskar
pense que
was
je
a
vais faire un
sign that
stream
Mandalore was
après.
the promised land, a
Juste
material that was hoped to
moi,
have
dans le
kept them
fond,
out of
sans
the
streaming
timeless
game,
battles between the
pour vous
lightsaber
laisser à
and the
savoir un
Jedi,
peu,
now named
un
after
peu
the
de moi,
Duchess, used to
que
vaporize
je
Mando's
travaille
remains
temps
on this
plein.
promised land. Luckily, they
Mais
were
je
able
pense que
to
vous le
destroy this
voyez, je
weapon
fais
and
souvent
see
des
that her
messages
people were
que
in
je
serious
suis
need of a
à mon
sole ruler.
travail.
Bo-Katan accepted the Darksaber and became the new Mando. All this time, Jango's unaltered clone,
C'est
Boba Fett,
aujourd'hui,
was rising
justement,
to
je
take
vous
on
en ai
his
fait
father's
un,
mantle,
ou peut-être
becoming the top bounty hunter in the galaxy. But instead of coming back to fight for Mandalorian independence,
aussitôt
he
j'ai un
served the
masque
Empire as a
d'en
hired gun.
face.
After the fall of the Empire,
Je
there was
suis à
another
mon lieu de
badass who was
travail,
known
dans le fond.
simply as the Mandalorian. His background and values are still unknown, but he is just another sign of the undying Mandalorian culture, with things like the sigil of the Sword being seen in places like Mos Espa's castle, and perhaps even the Mandalorian himself helping to finish the fight against the Empire. The final Sith Emperor, the last great all-mighty Sith that has plagued the Mandalorian gladiators. That concludes the story of the Mandalorian. In a separate video, I'll cover behind the scenes facts, because those are deep and interesting on their own, and there's enough to make a video. I'll also cover weapons, ships, tech, and society in more detail later, so be sure to keep an eye out for those videos. If you want to connect with us on social media, find ways that you can help support this channel without it costing you a thing,
Là,
or
j'essaie
check out our
d'apprendre à
Patreon.
parler
Be
un
sure
peu
to check
plus
out the link in the
quand je suis
description.
concentrée sur
Special
les
shout
jeux.
out to our supporters over on
Mon
Patreon.
Dieu, que je
But
parle
most
pas.
important of all,
Fait que je
remember,
m'efforce
only two
énormément.
things
Avec
are
le
responsible
temps, on
for all the
apprend
events
qu'il
of
faut qu'on
Star
discute un peu plus
Force
avec
and the
vous.
Mandalorians. So the Force and the
Mais vous ne me
Mandalorians be
parlez
with
pas
you
beaucoup.
always.
Ça, j'ai un YouTube puis un Facebook. Vous parlez pas. Vous pouvez me proposer des jeux, me poser des questions sur ma vie. Je travaille temps plein, je viens de faire des études pour pouvoir augmenter dans ma carrière, devenir une technicienne au lieu d'une préposée au bloc opératoire, ben, l'URDM qu'on appelle, la stérilisation. J'ai mon mari depuis 18 ans.
What's up, nerds? This video will be live with Lemon Josh.
On a eu un accident de char il n'y a pas très longtemps. Le char vient de revenir après un mois. Ça nous a pris un mois la préparation.
Can you see the loss of his loved ones? becoming
Fait qu'on a un toutou tout beau.
saving his species.
Mackenzie avait oublié d'arranger ici l'air climatisé parce qu'elle avait vidé le crayon. Puis oublié d'en remettre dedans. Mais là, tout est correct. Faut juste changer l'essieu d'un côté.
A cyborg that was only concerned with victory and
Les
cause.
sous-points d'archer,
Beyond the
là,
sense of good and
ils
evil,
trompent.
no honor, only rage. Willing to sacrifice anything and everything to provide him another chance to fight. So to start the story, let's head out to wild space, down to the tropical world of Khalif, home of the Khalif species. The exact year he was born is unknown, but given that their lifespan is similar to humans, we can reason that GaminG was born sometime around 60 BBY. Being
Non,
close in
ça
age,
c'est
though,
fait.
no. The species were red-skinned,
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a
reptilian
d'autre ici?
humanoids
Ah,
whose
les
entire
fleurs.
culture revolved around war and their religion.
Les
Tribal wars have
fleurs.
been constant throughout the history, with warriors slaying each other with their showy
Mais
spears
c'est ça,
or
mon
big swords.
GaminG est quand
And
même
later, when
assez
they got their hands on
surchargé.
alien tech, the most ubiquitous weapons were the
Mais
Zerpa arms
après le
out.
travail,
This was
on
not a
fait ce qu'on
plasma
veut.
firing blaster rifle.
On fait pas
It was
trop de
more of
bruit
a
pour
slug
réveiller le
gun,
conjoint
meaning
non
fire
plus.
a solid
C'est
projectile
pour ça que je
on
parle pas super
Shell's
fort
father
non
noted
plus.
that the boy's gift for anger could be shaped into a great warrior,
On
targeting
s'habille.
the slug rifle as soon as he could walk. Because at this time in their history, the Kalish were in the middle of the Hot War. For generations, his people had suffered endless attacks from
Je pense
technological
qu'après, je vais jouer à
The Kalish name for these spacefaring slavers was the Hut,
ATS.
meaning soulless bugs. People whose entire culture bred them for war against each other were now struggling to survive against the high-tech weaponry of the invaders. The one thing that all Kalish tribes tried to preserve the most were their burial sites. The ancestor gods had glorious temples, and it was believed that great martial victories could ensure one a spot in the heavens, perhaps even becoming a
Nos
god
vieilles
themselves.
amours, on avait débuté
Shalom was 8 years old.
notre
He was
stream
already
avec.
considered a great marksman and had 40 confirmed
On avait débuté le
kills.
stream ensemble,
22,
mon
he had killed
conjoint.
so many of these Indian bugs that the tribes were starting to see him as a sort of demigod.
Puis on
Throughout the war,
faisait
shamans
sur
would play a crucial
ATS,
role in keeping people
ETFs.
connected with the meaning of their dreams and their ancestors. And at this point in the war, his father had been slain by the Hut, leaving his moo skull mask to his son. One night, Shalal dreamt that he had hunted a moo, sort of boar and had slain it with a pair of lig swords. Upon awakening, he donned his father's mask and headed out to the jungles to slay the moo. And this was the first time he laid eyes on Randuru Ishkorma, a female Kalish, wearing a crabback skull mask and bearing 2 lig swords. He was struck with the significance of his dream that he was wearing the moo mask. He was the hunted one, to be slain by this woman. Not literally, not the loss of his physical life,
Allez, le
but she would kill
feu
that
est
part of him that
d'accord.
wished to fight alone, with a death to his old warrior bachelor side. Their relationship would be complicated and not fully understood by most of
Faut
them.
que j'en fasse 3 comme ça.
As the shaman saw them as the embodiment of ancient Kalish parables, their dream world also which is what the word Shalil literally means. The both feel having the dream and being dreamed of by her. And when these two united as one, Jalal and Kumar self-taught snipers. She increased his proficiency in flames. He trained her to be a good sniper. And together they were deadlier than entire tribes. Warring with the hunt was at its peak, and despite hundreds of thousands of dead bugs that now fertilized the forests of the fleet, these high-tech aliens were still unwavering. And Jalal's life would change forever after a seemingly routine attack in the Genoa regions. Their swarms, the Hutt were able to drive a wedge between them, separated or was surrounded and suffered a violent death, being ripped apart by the Hutt's barbed sheer weapon. Her body was dumped in the sea, the soulless ones of the tribe. Jalal knew his soulmate was lost. He was driven into madness at not being able to find her body. She could not receive a proper burial. Her soul would be denied an afterlife. She would never be able to gain her rightful place as a warrior goddess. None of the shamans could calm him down, and in his despair he set a course for the island monolith, the site from which the gods ascended into heaven. The sea journey was considered impossible, and he was able to solo navigate the most rocky sea. At the holy site, he pleaded with the gods to raise water from the water.
Ah, ça fait juste 1h30 que je stream. J'ai streamé plus qu'une heure sur Fortnite.
His cries received no answer. A sight that represented the physical connection to the heavens. The gods were silent. He had never had to accept defeat, but eventually he was forced to make the perilous journey back home. Doing what he could to try to remain powerful in his war-torn community. He would attempt a normal life, taking 10 wives and fathering 30 children. Nothing could get his mind off the injustices done to him by the Hawk, the silence of the gods. He was no longer the one the shamans had spoken of, a dreamer and a trembler. He was no longer a bearer of the joined opposite of this world, merely grieving. He would reject his symbolic name, accepting that it was his lot in life to be the tormented warrior, the grievous one. But he also decided that he would not be the only one to suffer. The man who now called himself Grievous decided to take command of all Kalish tribal war efforts, unifying their people by approaching Azostra, the most elite of all the warriors spread across the planet. Taking the title of Kagan, the supreme commander and warlord, this vengeance-fueled united force was finally able to get the Huck to flee off-world. He was able to capture many of their spacecraft, contacted other spacefaring alien species for transports and advanced weapons of war, and for the first time in countless generations, the Kalish were offensive. Kagan Grievous was able to conquer several Huck worlds, raising them to ash, slaughtering entire populations, as the insectoids watched the borders of their slave empire constricted with all stocks. Next was the Huck War. Just as Grievous was about to taste victory by putting an end to the killers of his father and lover, the enslavers of countless millions of Kalish over centuries, now, and only just now, was a time that the Jedi and the Republic thought it was wise to commit. They saw the Kalish people as the spacefaring monsters. Maddening and insulting irony is the only way the Kalish would be able to get to space by capturing the slave ships that had been taking away their loved ones for countless generations. The slave trade which this noble republic and Jedi order had done to stop. Just as the Hutt had allies sympathetic to them in the Senate, politics would be the new oppressor of the Kalish people. Despite being painted as a bloodthirsty warlord, mass murderer, and conqueror, in his role as Kagan, he would try to keep up the offensive, being so close to stopping the Hutt threat once and for all. Even with the vastly greater military force of the Republic, Grievous actually kept up the assault on the front, only succumbing to the mysterious magician warriors of the Jedi Knights. Even tranced at the sight of their energy sabers, which the Jedi were able to use to turn the tide of war and push the Kalish forces back to their homeworld. They then put in enormous fines and established punitive
Oui, je
trade
crois que
embargoes,
c'était ma
making it so
deuxième.
they
Je
could not
portais
join the
certaines.
galactic
On
market
retournait
in peaceful
voir.
free trade. Grievous was fuming at being beaten just moments before his total
Ah non,
victory,
j'en ai un
and
autre.
watched as the Republic policies led to
Oups,
mass poverty
juste.
and starvation, as all off-world trade came to a complete halt. Then the banks came in. Sand Hill, chairman of the
Troisième
Intergalactic
fleur.
Banking Plan, personally made an introduction to the famed warlord, the bank that backed the Republic credits, the government that had slandered and defeated him, wanted to hire the infamous warlord as the
Tu fais
commander
ma
of their
belle
private
pifa.
droid army. He would go from demigod to death
Une belle
collector.
petite chatte
Sand Hill
d'Espagne
said
tout
the
en amour
banking
avec
plan
moi
could
qui n'est
solve
pas
the
à moi.
entire debt of the Kalish
C'est
people,
Chat, mon
if
frère.
only he would fight for
Allez,
the
elle m'a
IGBC,
baptisé.
stunned at what seemed to be just the latest of the cruel tricks the gods were playing on him. Grievous reluctantly agreed, and the bank actually kept their promise. No more debt, and even showed the political pull in removing all embargoes, while actively promoting trade to his homeland. It was an odd path towards saving his people, but Grievous was willing to accept his fate, knowing he was essentially the slave of the banking plan, but at least he would be the last Kalish to ever know slavery, and he would be fully faithful to his new master, turning their droid forces into one of the greatest militaries in the galaxy. At that time, the IGBC had ranks of the factoid combat automata known as B-1 droids, as well as the GAT and IG-227 Hellfire, while also having enormous fleets with starships like the Magnificent class and Marcel transporters. Grievous immediately hated the B-1s as being useless and downright insulting to what it meant to be a warrior. It was the embodiment of the soulless, high-tech principles that these aliens from the galaxy had brought, out of touch with their gods, their dream realms of their own souls. The virtue and honor that can only be gained by striving with your own hands, not using your mind and credits to create toys to play for while you sit in some posh office. That being said, the bankers were vehement proponents of organics, out of fear that the charismatic war lord would be against them, organics not having that convenient kill switch that can be activated. But, understanding his frustration, Dooku allowed Sand Hill to provide Grievous a droid model far superior to the B1. These came to respect the IG, but after some time programming them in the combat center. He said that they could fight as ferociously as his companions. He could become unsettled by the fact that these things were extremely quiet, or free of many of the weaknesses. But after some time, he felt that he was surrounded by advanced droid versions of his warriors, and the bankers were more than happy to do with the efficiency of the new intellect. This easily could have been the end of his life, being a corporate warlord that just kept the press going to the halls of the IGBC, and occasionally proudly looking back to see his people prosper. The hunt could not leave his people alone. In an unbelievable move, they had launched a new wave of attacks to try to take back areas they had previously. Many strikes they either accidentally, though some police thought purposefully, desecrated the sacred burial mounds and temples. These bugs had terrorized and enslaved his people for their entire lives, and found ways to attack them from capital. When the Republic again did nothing, Grievous went into a fury. Abandoning his position with the banking and droid army, he rushed back home to prepare a counteroffensive. Sand Hill was quite a difficult place. He could not allow this betrayal to go unpunished, but also this fallacious too fine a specimen to just kill off. So, though he considered hiring an assassin, he thought this was too fresh. Instead, he contacted Pablo Blessing, the Archduke of Geonosis and overseer of droid factories. Together with Count Dooku and his shadowy superior Darth Sidious, they all devised a way to permanently enslave this great warrior, but also to ensure that he has control of the muzzle droid. With assurances that a cybernetic body could be constructed with the facilities of that Jedi workshops, and the Sith promising they could manipulate his mind through the Force, the plan was put into action. Grievous had just rallied for Zatra, and together they boarded a ship for the Mark, heading out to bring the fight to the hub once and for all. Shortly after takeoff, an ion bomb planted in the shuttle was detonated. Ship failures caused a series of explosions. Dooku activated a remote control of Grievous's ejector seat, saving the asset they were all after, while letting the transport full of his warriors plunge down into the sea, the same sea that had consumed Kamar years earlier. All of his elite generals died in the crash. Grievous had suffered internal injuries that were causing hemorrhaging. This sent him into shock. Dooku was there to personally recover the unconscious elite. He used an obscure Sith heartstone ability to keep his heart from failing. While Grievous was unconscious, holding onto life by this force application to his organs, the Sith also used his dark arts to implant ideas in Grievous's mind. When he came to, he was certain that the Jedi were responsible for the death of the Zatra. In their fears of Grievous's return, they launched a preemptive strike to save their evil allies, the Hutt. Magna Guards had responded to the explosion and dragged his body into a shuttle containing an FX series medical droid, which was able to sustain and sedate him for his geonosis. Dooku arranged to
Là,
plant
la
a
semaine
portable
n'est pas
Jabon inside
recommencée.
Diaz and
Elle
extract
recommence
the
dans
transfer it into
3
Grievous
jours.
to aid in this manipulation. Pablo the Lesser
Tout
personally
ça est
oversaw the
complété.
Geonosis scientists that extracted his eyes, brain, and spinal cord, transferring them into the uranium alloy body that was based on the craft origin. A synth-skin gut sac was created to house the rest of his remaining organs. And it needs to be pointed out that his physical body was not destroyed by the explosion. He was just knocked unconscious. He did have internal bleeding, but that was fixed quickly. He could have remained in his body. This project
Pour
treated the noble demigod as just another
je
piece of
dirais
fabric.
que c'est
Although they
terminé.
had its masters, the body was discarded. Even the brain was altered to
Là, je me
revitalize every
demande
memory and his connection to his people and culture.
quel jeu que je peux jouer, soit sur le PlayStation. Je vous donne le choix. J'ai plusieurs jeux sur le PlayStation, plusieurs sur la Switch et sur Steam. C'est pas ce qui me manque. Mais Forza 4 ne fonctionne pas, encore moins Forza 5 sur le programme. Il fait qu'il lag. So, j'ai plusieurs jeux, si je vous montre Steam. Je joue. Moi, j'ai le goût de jouer à ETS. À moins que je fasse un stream plus tard pour pouvoir le faire. Je pense que c'est peut-être ce que je vais faire. un stream plus tard qui est juste ETS.
Despite all the force powers to manipulate his mind, surgeries to restructure his brain, still hated to be one
Ouais. Fait que ce que je vais faire, je vais vous laisser pour ce soir. On se revoit demain dans les mêmes heures. Et si vous êtes encore là plus tard, je dirais, ouais, 3 heures du matin. Peut-être que dans les 4-5 heures ou bientôt, si je dois changer mon setup parce que, regardez-moi ça, là. C'est un setup avec la stéréo. C'est vraiment hot, puis il y a une chaise de tour, un banc de tour. C'est vraiment impressionnant. J'ai mis une photo, me semble, dans le stream. Puis c'est vraiment comme tu te sens dans une auto. Tu peux t'accoter pour le bras. T'as même un cup holder sur le côté. T'as vraiment tout. Tu peux pas rien avoir de surplus sur cette setup-là. Fait que sur ce, je vous dis à bientôt. Parce que je pense que je vais settler les choses pour pouvoir jouer à ETS. Euro Truck Simulator. Ok, c'est juste du driving, mais c'est le fun. Relax driving, avant de te coucher, ça fait du bien. Fait que je vous laisse aller. Moi, je vais aller faire un tour dans Final Fantasy 14 un peu. Puis je vous rejoins plus tard. Bye, bonne journée, bonne soirée, bonne nuit. Et merci d'être passé en aussi grand nombre. Bye.